One thing we normally do, you'll have heard this at the start, and Ian's just alluded to this, that we are sponsored by the Made to Be Measured campaign. Now, I'm going to do the sponsor read live, okay, as we start the podcast. Apparently, I do a different voice, and I just don't think that's true.
He's on Times Radio, you know.
Thank you, Andy. Friday, Saturday, Sunday breakfast, 6 a.m. Thank you. Right, so we are recording. Okay, you don't have to be, just go with me on this. A dram of whiskey is one of life's little pleasures. But have you ever wondered how much... I'll do it again. A dram of whiskey is one of life's little pleasures. But have you ever wondered how many units of alcohol are in the glass, Geoff? One measure of Scotch is 1 unit of alcohol. Holyrood Sources is proud to be brought to you by the Scotch Whisky Association's Made to Be Measured campaign to help us all understand how much alcohol we are really drinking. Sean Connery. Find out more at scotch-whisky.org.uk/made-to-be-measured. And the podcast starts now.
Welcome to Johnny Walker Princes Street for the recording of Holyrood Sources Live with First Minister Humza Yousaf. This is Holyrood Sources Live with Calum Macdonald, Geoff Aberdein and Andy Maciver.
Live from Johnny Walker Princes Street in Edinburgh, I'm Calum Macdonald, and we are so thrilled to be brought to you by the Scotch Whisky Association's Made to Be Measured campaign. Here we are, a prime Edinburgh spot, bringing you an extended conversation with the First Minister of Scotland, Humza Yousaf. Live here from the Johnny Walker Experience, demonstrating that we, unlike politicians, can organise the proverbial in a distillery. Always drink responsibly. Food and drinks are available this evening. Hope you've been enjoying those. If you're looking for somebody to get around in after the show, my advice is make sure they're not using an SNP credit card. It likely won't work, or it'll get everybody in trouble. Right, let's welcome the Ben and Nevis of Scottish political commentary, the Caledonian and McBrain of political insight. You will not need any deposit return scheme on your tickets this evening. No scheme required. It's the man who puts the dream in Aberdein, the sparkle of the Granite City, and the man who ran the country while Alex Salmond took the credit. It's Geoff Aberdein. Did you run the country?
Yes.
Good. He's probably the only Conservative staffer who's wanted to abolish the Tory party. And he can't get enough of the green dogs running Scotland today. It's Andy Maciver. Okay, a couple of admin... Oh, go on, sorry. Do you want a right of reply?
It's a bit better for him than it was for me, isn't it?
So's his electoral success.
I mean, I could have given you some...
You've been done. We're 2 minutes in and you've been done.
If you'd asked me for my lines like you asked him for his lines, then...
I asked nobody for their party lines. Right, a couple of admin bits for those of you who are here in the room this evening, and we're so thankful that you're here. We're so glad to see you. You can submit questions to be asked of the First Minister, who'll join us shortly. The literal First Minister of Scotland will be sitting on this chair with the green cushion in a moment or two. If you want to submit your questions, go to holyroodsources.com/ask. If you're tweeting along on Elon Musk's fever dream social networking site, use the hashtag HolyroodSourcesLive. And if you're tweeting pictures, crucially, ideally wait till you get my good side. That's that one. If this is the first time you've heard the podcast, welcome. Thank you so much for being here. And what a time to join us as we get ready to welcome the First Minister of Scotland onto the episode. Follow the podcast, subscribe to it, be part of it from here on out. Right, 30 seconds each of you, because we need to get to the First Minister. Geoff, what are you expecting? What are you hoping for out of this discussion tonight?
Yeah, well, what I'm hoping for is to kind of tease out a little bit more about who Humza Yousaf is as First Minister. I've said before in the podcast, I think he's been characterised by what he doesn't want to do. But what does he want to do as First Minister? And I think the great thing about this podcast is we'll give him a bit of a window to do that. We'll ask some probing questions, but we must find out a little bit more about his vision for Scotland. I don't think that's been apparent yet.
Andy?
Yeah, I mean, look, the truth is that at the moment, in policy terms, Humza is still Nicola Sturgeon 2.0. Nothing's really changed in terms of outcomes and delivery and policy, but he has to now be his own man. And I think this format will allow him to do that. He's got plenty of time. If Geoff keeps quiet, he's got plenty of time. And he will, he's going to be able to, this is his best format, I think. He's going to be able to articulate what he wants to say, offer the vision that he wants to offer, and he's going to have the time and the space to do it. So I'm going to be really interested myself to see how he does, and he's going to have some pretty challenging topics to be talking about, so I'm going to be interested to see how he does. I think it's going to be pretty revealing.
Yeah, great. Now, you all know by now this podcast is constructive. That's what we always want to do. That's our absolute mission statement, is not to be aggressive, not to be insulting necessarily. Disagreement is valid. You hear disagreement. Disagreement is fine. But please, please bear in mind that your disagreement has to be civil this evening. Not all podcasts have been in the last couple of weeks, but they're just badly managed. Right. Shall we welcome the First Minister of Scotland, Humza Yousaf? Hello.
Very good.
Thanks
Good
for
to
being
see you.
here.
Good. How are you? Good to see you. Very well. Got something different to me.
You all right?
I was going to say he's got a
Comfy.
different drink to me, but
I'm actually having beer, as is
in a mug. Yeah, it was well hidden.
It's not whiskey. Made
Always
to be measured.
made to be measured. Great to see you, First Minister. Thank you for
so
being
much.
here.
That's all right.
I mentioned badly managed podcasts that you've done in the last couple of weeks. Can I just clear up, are you going to swear on this podcast?
No, I'm not. I will try my best to be well behaved. My mum did send me the screenshot of the news article afterwards, and she did say, I hope you didn't say the full word, because it was asterisked out, to which I may have told, no, I didn't, I told her the truth. I will do my best to be on my best behaviour.
Well, that's all we can ask. That's all we can ask. Do you know something I'm interested in, just as we sort of say hello to you and welcome you onto the podcast? How has the transition been for you from being a minister to being First Minister? You had government experience previously. What is it like now?
Just nothing can quite prepare you for the transition. It is huge, actually, and it's much bigger a transition than I would have thought, because I thought, as you say, I've been in government 11 odd years, taken on some pretty big roles, I think it's fair to say. Within government, there's no shortage of a national profile, even, but it is completely different in how it changes your life, but also just how you your day-to-day job and how you have to try to navigate the political landscape. So it doesn't matter what position you're in. I was Cabinet Secretary for Health, as you know, during a pretty challenging period indeed. But no matter how challenging or difficult the decision was that you had to make, it was always the backstop of the First Minister. You could go into the office, have 5-10 minutes, have that conversation, run something past Nicola, and go, right, okay, that's the right decision to make. I am the backstop. And people come to me, and you've got to be absolutely all over the detail of every single brief in government, and you've got to trust your team. And for politicians, most of us are control freaks, frankly, and just having to let go of a little bit of that control and making sure that your team are empowered to make decisions and the right decisions. That's a bit of a transition.
Quite a change.
Quite a change, and then your life changes entirely.
Yeah.
I remember. It was the result was on the 27th, wasn't it, of March, on the Monday in Murrayfield. Got the result, and spoke to my family, and then I need to go to the loo, and they came out, and there's 2 security guards there. I'm like, "Are you for me?" And they're like, "Yeah," and they've not left my side since.
Really?
And it's a completely different way of living. Those who have kids will know, or you may be better than I am as a parent, but making plans with kids can be quite challenging. It's a bit last minute. But you can't really be last minute, because your security needs to know where you're going, what you're doing. And just having a trip to the park has suddenly become a lot more complicated.
Yeah.
So there's a whole adjustment that I could
Yeah.
talk for hours. I won't, but I could talk for hours about how life has completely changed.
I suppose as part of that as well, do you feel like you are leading the SNP at the most difficult time in its history?
Certainly one of the most difficult periods.
What
I
makes it? What
struggle.
makes it?
I struggle to think of a more difficult time, but there have been challenges. I was talking to a member, one of our members of the Scottish Parliament, who's been in the SNP for a long, long time, almost 4 decades. She was telling me, and she did say, "Look, we have come through tough times before." And I remember, John Swinney's leadership and difficult times then. I wasn't in the party and don't remember more difficult times in the 70s and 80s, but certainly we've had difficult times. But this is without a doubt some of the most challenging months the party has faced. And to be frank, we don't know what the future holds either, and it could be more challenging before it gets easier.
Just on that, I mean, challenging times in the party, no doubt. But before 2007, the SNP had never been in government, never won a national election. So the opportunity to affect change, the opportunity to chart a different course is there, and it's of your making if you choose it.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's the exciting part. People ask me time and time again, for almost every day in the 130 odd days that I've been First Minister of Scotland, they say to me, if you knew what was coming, would you still have done it? Do you really enjoy it? And my answer to that is absolutely, because you do not get the chance many times in your life, I suspect never more than once, to be First Minister of Scotland. And it's a huge honour, as well as a massive opportunity. For those of us, and I suspect that's everybody in this room, love our country, the opportunity to lead it for however long, years and years, months, I don't know if you outlive the lettuce, I don't know, whatever it is, however long you have, to be able to make that change at this level, on this scale, to me is such a massive opportunity. Shape the direction of the country, achieve something huge. And my desire, of course, is for Scottish independence, to achieve one of the biggest things I think our country will experience in hundreds of years.
We'll get to that for sure, I want to ask you about something that was happening today. This is Sir Keir Starmer's visit to Rutherglen and Hamilton West. It's fair to say, is it not, that it's Keir Starmer's by-election to lose at this point?
Well, I mean, the Labour have practically kind of put up the bunting and kind of popped the champagne corks already. They're talking not about winning the by-election, they're talking about by what margin they're going to win the by-election. So they're extremely, well, I would say complacent, if I'm honest, and I don't think they should be. I mean, I've spent many weeks, in fact months now, knocking doors in Rutherglen and Hamilton West, and it's, of course, going to be challenging, given the circumstances of Margaret Ferrier, given the circumstances of the party. It's going to be difficult. But I'm certainly not despondent or without hope at all. I mean, our vote is strong, but it needs a reason to come out and to make sure it votes for us. And there will be tactical voting in a seat that's often changed hands between ourselves and Labour. But Labour are, I think, complacent, and that's a dangerous place to be.
I was just thinking, Humza, when you said about one chance to lead. So it would probably be a fair analysis of certainly the 2016 to 2021 government that it was competent but managerial, might not have been particularly radical. You've obviously entered at a pretty difficult time in terms of getting through the noise that's going on and getting your own vision there. Is there something in the background there? Are you ready to be radical? Because Scotland has a lot of problems now that it didn't have in 2016, some that are needing quite urgently fixed. I mean, and I think people would forgive you for holding back a bit because of everything that's been going on. But is it ready? Is it there? Maybe even after the general election, as you run up to Holyrood, to say, this is what Yousafism is. This is what I am now. I'm just not a continuation of what's gone on before. I've actually got a new and better idea.
Yeah,
I mean, call it euphemism.
Yeah, for that reason.
We're trying to get
That's getting
Geoffology.
edited.
Yeah, Geoffology.
We're trying to get Geoffology to catch up.
Yeah, eusonomics. I'm not sure it quite works. I think two things. One, the cut-through point is a really important one. It's been one of the biggest challenges. Let's be frank. In the first, as I say, few months of the role, and really, you talked about not swearing, so I'll do my best here. But I remember the first couple of weeks of being first, not even first couple of weeks, first few days, of being First Minister. Obviously, there's a lot of ceremony you have to go through, and it was a great honour to be part of that ceremony in terms of court, succession, the vote in Parliament, etc., etc. And we thought, like, we get ourselves to Easter recess, and that's the point where you've got 2 weeks, no parliamentary business. You go out there, everybody's dead interested in what's Humza Yousaf got to say. We go out there, we had a whole policy platform. Here's visits that we're going to do to talk about X, Y, and Z. A really good visit for the first day. It was in the northeast, talking about just transition. Additional funding announced for that. Second day, Peter Murrow gets arrested. That's it. You know, blown out of the water. You know, for the next 2 weeks, if not longer, actually, but certainly that 2 week period. Okay, got another opportunity. Policy prospectus. This is your document. This is what you're going to deliver. Takes you up to 2026. Colin Beattie gets arrested.
Is that day in Parliament?
On that day.
Yeah, it was.
On that day. And so getting cut through, I'm kind of scared about what will happen to PFG, right enough, but when we go back for Programme for Government. But it is one of those ones where cut through and trying to get cut through, I think, has been one of the biggest challenges.
Yeah.
In terms of being bold, being radical, absolutely. I suppose what you've also got to do as a leader is try to play to your strengths. So where are your strengths? Where are your weaknesses? Understanding those. I think my strengths have often been trying to bring people with us on a journey, trying to listen to even those voices that will oppose us. I've been spending a lot of time these last few weeks and months listening to people that wouldn't naturally be aligned to us. In fact, some of them actually openly hostile. Meeting with them, hearing from them. Okay, you may not agree with me, my politics, certainly might not agree with independence, but you know what? You're a wealth creator, you're a businessman, woman, you're an innovator. Let's hear what you've got to say.
Yeah. What
What can we do better? I think that's well, as I say, you'll find out in a couple of weeks' time in terms of the Programme for Government, the vision that I hope and the direction.
Just tell us now if you want.
Yeah, exactly.
As an exclusive.
We're happy to listen. Good. Thank you very much. Right, we've got lots to get through. As you know, you can submit questions. You can do that even now as you're listening to the podcast as well. This is all about you being able to ask Humza Yousaf, the First Minister, questions and hearing conversation as a result. Will Searle, are you here, Will? Good evening, Will. Thank you for submitting your question. And by the way, you might have noticed if you tried to submit a question, there is a little box in there for you to add a compliment about the podcast. Because as you know, when you do that... Pardon?
You can say a compliment about me if you wish. I don't get many of them.
We didn't add that box in the form.
We're never going to read out that, mate.
As you know, if you compliment the podcast, you're more likely to get your email read out. Will, you had an interesting one about the by-election and about the kind of battle that's going on as well. If you want to stand up, feel free. If you don't, you feel free to sit down. It's your podcast.
I'm going to write my question down. Well, I can give you a compliment because your amazing ability to keep a straight face whilst you're asked about 50-year-old Karens and Mary Black was amazing the other day. Well done for that. It was this daft question, so well done for keeping a straight face.
Thank you.
Compliment for the podcast, though.
Oh,
You've given me
thanks,
a new podcast claim to fame because back in 2007, I started working for the Tory party. It's only 5 years. I've gone past
Did you
that
try
now.
to abolish it too?
I was sort of on that team, yeah.
Right.
But
See?
when I started...
You're onto something.
When I started working for the Tories in 2007, one of the things I had to clean out in the Tory office when I first started was from the old election candidates back in May 2007. There's a guy called Andy Maciver cleaned out
There we go.
loads of
Different class.
materials.
Different class. League of his own.
Sorry.
What's your question, Will?
More election. So the upcoming by-election will be a straight fight between Labour and SNP, but it poses an interesting fight between the Tories in London versus Edinburgh. We need to talk about more Tory infighting, right? That's always fun. So Edinburgh will want the SNP to win, as it gives them a better chance of holding on to seats in Scotland. But Rishi Sunak will surely...
Will Edinburgh want Labour to win?
Edinburgh won't leave.
Edinburgh want Labour to win,
That
but
would mean, yeah.
London will want the SNP to win. So how do you think Rishi Sunak's going to try and tip the scales, and do you think you can do that? And
Do you know, let's get a quick response from Andy.
Yeah, I mean, the quick response for that is that in many ways the Conservative and Unionist Party is actually two different parties. So the vast majority of Tory MSPs here are here not to be in government or to win, but purely to stop India F2, stop the SNP from winning majorities. They are Unionists largely, more than they are Conservatives. They're not particularly interested in ideology. They're interested really just in ultra-unionism, I suppose, if you want to call it that. So they will always want Labour to beat the SNP. Sunak will be looking at a numbers game more than anything else and trying to arrest momentum. So this tension has always been present in the Tory party. And I think your analysis is probably right. I think if you said to Douglas Ross, who do you fancy winning, he'd privately probably say Labour, thanks. And if you asked Sunak, he'd say SNP.
Not so privately. I mean, Douglas Ross has pretty much said to his Conservative supporters, you should vote for Labour. You should vote for the party. I mean, London slapped him down.
Yeah.
For that, but
Been there before.
He's not really said it privately. Yeah, he's not said it privately.
It's so interesting to talk about the by-election. Geoff, I know that you've been sort of analysing
Yeah, I
by-election
mean,
context.
I heard what you said earlier on, Humza, and to a certain extent I agree. But the problems with the SNP and the falling of the SNP happened before your election as First Minister. My own company conducted a poll towards the end of last year, which started to show an emerging trend that the SNP vote was on the slide. And I wonder if you really appreciate the gravity of the situation facing you electorally. So there's been 5 by-elections, local by-elections, different parts of the country since the turn of the year. The first one, just before you took office, although the SNP won it, there was a 9% swing against, and that was in Aberdein to the Labour. On the 20th of June, we had a 13% swing to Labour in Bells Hill. In July the 8th, we had the SNP vote down 8%, third place behind the Tories. Now, the other 2 you weren't competitive in anyway, but you've won 1 out of 5. And on those swings that I've just mentioned, you're in for a tough time in Rutherglen, and you might be in for a tough time in the general election. So why do you think people are not either turning out for the SNP, or why are they not voting for the SNP when they are turning out?
Yeah. So, I mean, you could spend literally, and we won't obviously, but you could spend the whole podcast talking about a variety of issues. So there is, of course, the natural laws of politics have been 16 years in government, and people will, of course, find something that they disagree with that hasn't gone right, and of course, our political opponents rightly. So if I was in their position, I would do the same, jump all over it. So there is 16 years of government, and there is some fatigue, and you've got to, as Andy was suggesting, you've got to sound bold, radical. We've got to make sure people have a reason to vote for us. And I think people genuinely are crying out for some sort of vision, some sort of leadership, because they see a lack of it, frankly, in politics right across the UK, and we should be able to deliver that. The second reason is there's just no getting away from it. The difficulty of the police investigation. You're right, there were some challenges before of a different scale now, and there's no doubt that the police investigation has had cut through. I told you a moment ago, I've knocked how many doors, and it's not the number one issue. Cost of living crisis is still the issue that comes up most often, but it comes up often enough, and there's no doubt that people are questioning, and I've had this literally said to me quite a number of times, okay, you guys are the same as them, and that's challenging for us. And again, we're not in control of that, and the police investigation will unfold in the way it's going to unfold. For me, I think there's also got to be a reason to vote for the SNP. And one of the big messages that we are going hard on, and we will do in the by-election, is that the closer Keir Starmer aligns himself with Conservative policies, be it today talking about a fairer way to implement the rape clause, or retaining the 2-child cap, not scrapping the bedroom tax, we'll continue to say that actually the real alternative for people in Scotland is not going to be voting for Labour. The real alternative for Scotland is to choose its own future as an independent country. The difficulty in all of that is people need to know, how will we get there? So look, you don't have to tell me the numbers, the facts, the figures. Trust me, I live and breathe those numbers, and have many a challenging sleepless night thinking about how we arrest ourselves from what is a difficult situation. But I also remind ourselves, the point that Calum was making, has there ever been a more difficult time for the SNP? I struggle to remember it, but we still lead in virtually every single poll. Now, that's not to be complacent, but that is to say we still have a solid base of support.
Can I just follow up then? You and I met each other recently, had a great chat, and I'm not going to reveal the contents of all that conversation because this is a
Geoff, go
family
on.
show.
It was all minutes, isn't it?
But there was one thing I did say to you, I hope you don't mind me saying, I said, look, you get one shot at this. One shot at this. Don't look back in 18 months' time and go, I wish I'd done this, I wish I'd said that.
Yeah.
Now, if I was to characterise your first period, opening period as First Minister, whether it's been the highly protected marine areas, whether it's been the deposit return scheme, whether it's been trying to mollify EPC and boiler systems, whatever the issue is, it seems to me that you're trying to find the path to least resistance. You're trying to appeal to everyone. You're trying to not piss off everyone. And when you do that, you don't appeal to anyone, in my experience. So you mentioned the programme for government, and Andrew mentioned you going forward and trying to put a Yousafism on it. Are we going to get more conviction? Because I know how much this job means to you. Yeah. I know how much it means to you, but I don't think they know. Yeah. And I don't think the people on the ground know. So when are you going to introduce yourself to them?
And that's exactly what the programme for government, and to an extent, we're trying to do this summer. But you have to, when you come into the role, as I have, and there are issues that are dominating, bubbling away, causing challenges, there is a bit of a need to sometimes not entirely clear the decks, but there is a need to have to say, right, there are some issues here that need dealt with. The alcohol advertising was a classic example. I make no apologies at all for saying that I believe that we have to tackle Scotland's problematic relationship with alcohol. And the Made to Be Measured campaign, Mark and I from Scottish Whisky Association, were just talking about how we can do that collaboratively together. But the alcohol advertising consultation, the disinformation around it was causing such concern about things we were never going to do. So there's a need to sometimes clear the decks of certain problematic issues. But you're absolutely right. You kind of hit the nail on the head, me as a politician, but I think most politicians ultimately, at our heart, end up being people pleasers because we think, well, what gets us the most votes? Because we please that side and bring everybody together, and that'll hopefully get us, it's good for the country anyway, in terms of a way of progressing, but actually, it could be electorally quite helpful as well. But you absolutely, as a leader, as a First Minister, you have to have conviction and choose a side. Frankly, do you
feel you've chosen a side?
In a lot of issues, but there's a number of issues where, again, in the programme for government, it will become pretty clear. And if I give you one example, or one issue, I think the biggest existential issue our planet faces, and that's one of the climate emergency. And, you can't kind of sit on the fence. You can't be mealy-mouthed about it. You have to pick a side. And I know what side I'm absolutely on. In a time where the Prime Minister, hold on, Geoff, you have plenty to say all the time. You never stop
all
talking.
The time. I know.
In a time where literally this summer, I don't think I've ever seen a summer where every single week we've seen with such visibility the impact of the climate emergency right across the world. And we've got our Prime Minister literally saying that he's on the side of the motorists, sitting in Margaret Thatcher's old Rolls Royce and making it a wedge issue. Now you've got Keir Starmer saying we're going to roll back on ultra-low emission zones. This is a time for politicians to take more action on tackling the climate emergency, not less action. So, yes, I will be choosing sides because that's what you have to do. And frankly, that's going to piss off some people.
So you've said it. But hold on a second. You've just said pissing off people and picking sides. But my analysis, and you will disagree with this, no doubt, but on the issues that I mentioned, all those issues, you sought to nullify them, amend them, try and make sure that you didn't, and we'll come to the Greens, I'm sure, and you are sitting in a green cushion, by the way. I thought you'd want my one, the yellow. But you didn't so much take a side. You could have come in and said, you know what, I've got my feet under the table, I'm in Butte House, and gone, nah, this is not good enough. We're going to reverse all this and made a virtue of it. Get up to a lectern, make a big speech to the nation and say, not happening, not happening, not happening. We're going to move forward with my agenda, which is X, Y, and Z. And we're still waiting to hear the X, Y, and Z. But you didn't get the benefit. What I'm saying is political capital that you could have got from those first few days in office, from cancelling all those policies, you didn't get the benefit for it.
No, so there's many policies that I think, in the initial days went straight into going, right, we need to resolve and try to make progress on those issues. So DRS, a classic example where we heard from the industry, we said, okay, I think Mark was at that first meeting we held with all the stakeholders around the table. And we said, right, we're going to delay, we're going to do this, we're going to make changes, we're going to tweak. And then, of course, we had the UK government take the action that they take. And so, yes, there's some things we can absolutely, and I can absolutely do as First Minister. I'm also, unfortunately, at the mercy of a UK government that is flexing its muscles in a way that is trying to undermine that Parliament building just a mile or so away from here. But you're right. I think ultimately there's not actually much disagreement. My challenge has been cut through in the first few months. Programme for government, I really hope, gives me the opportunity to say this is what I stand for, and the administration that I lead the government that I lead, this is what we stand for.
Got you. We're going to get a question from Sam Taylor in just a sec. Put your hand up, Sam, and we'll get a microphone to you. Just on taking a side, First Minister, especially on environmental issues, should Baillie Gifford be sponsoring the Edinburgh International Book Festival? It's led to lots of authors walking out. They're protesting their connections to
And they've got every right
oil
to.
and gas.
Yeah, they've got every right to. But I know for a fact that we would not have an Edinburgh International Book Festival if it wasn't for sponsors like Baillie Gifford.
So that's fine.
And others. No, I think they've been on a journey. And if we're going to be absolutely binary about it and say, look, only companies that have no investment whatsoever in fossil fuels, they're
That's
the
taking
only.
a side. That's taking a
They're
stand,
the only
isn't
one.
it?
Well,
If you
actually,
were to say that.
what you could say, taking a stand, is what you could say is, well, one, we support the arts because they're really important to Scotland. But secondly, when it comes to Baillie Gifford, are they on the journey? Are they going in the right direction? Do they have a commitment to de-invest? And they absolutely do, and they've shown that and demonstrated that.
Okay, so you support that. You're happy with them sponsoring the festival?
Well, look, as I said, I don't think we would have an Edinburgh International Book Festival if we didn't have Baillie Gifford and others supporting. So I think these things are absolutely a judgment call for the festival to make. But ultimately, if they're on the journey to disinvestment, in terms of fossil fuels, then I think that's a good thing.
Sure. holyroodsources.com/ask if you want to submit your question. Sam did that. Sam, hello. Thank you for your compliment. Essential listening for Scottish politics nerds. Thanks very much. We'll take that, Sam. What's your question?
So, when the economic prospectus paper was published last October, it did not include a fiscal plan for independence. So there was no information about what would happen to public spending in an independent Scotland, no information about what would happen to taxes in an independent Scotland. If you want the next general election to be about independence, and I think you do, will you commit to publishing a proper fiscal plan before that election?
So it's definitely something we're looking at. It's actually something that an organisation called Believe in Scotland, headed by Gordon McIntyre Kemp, were pushing us on, pushing me on actually in the early days that I took office. And I think it's a suggestion that comes from every side of the debate on independence. So we should absolutely give as much information as we possibly can around what we would do, frankly, what would the balance sheet look like, what tax levers would we have, how do we use them, etc., etc. That can only be done in a certain point in time, though, which is challenging. But I take the premise and accept the premise that if we want people to have a fully formed debate and want to make a fully informed choice on independence, the more information we can give them on what the fiscal and economic outlook of the country would be with independence, I think is absolutely important. So it's something and I am very actively considering.
I mean, I think it's probably fair to say that in 2014, it's first independence referendum, and I think polling would back this up, and I think pollsters would back this up, that if there's one thing that stopped you getting over the line, it was the perceived lack of a vision, of a plan for the economy of Scotland after independence. I don't think that's changed at all, if I'm being honest, since 2014. I haven't seen anything coming forward really from government to create a credible economic strategy and to show people how they will be better off in independent Scotland than they would in the UK. And, I operate in the SME community in particular every day, and I know there are a lot of centrists, a lot of relatively non-partisan people, of which I would include myself, to be honest, who are not emotionally or ideologically opposed to the concept of independent Scotland, but simply couldn't do it because it's too risky. And it hasn't been de-risked with what they would see as sensible economic policy and economic strategy. And the truth is, the only person they've heard that from is Kate Forbes during the leadership election. I mean, that you do hear that, people say that, a lot of unionists found it refreshing at that point. Is it in your mind that in order not just for the SNP to continue to win, but in order to create the foundation to have any chance of independence, because, I mean, you're at least 10 points away from really even thinking about being able to be certain about winning, where is the economy in that for you?
Look, the economy is absolutely central because there's no getting away from the fact that you don't have to go to a pollster to know where we lost the last independence referendum. There was many issues, currency being one of them, the economy more generally, fiscal and monetary policy, And for me, what will shift the dial on independence, and this is not just for the economy, this is across a range of areas, is if we are giving people a reason to vote for independence. Now, what has changed since 2014, we have seen a significant decline in terms of the UK and its economy and generally actually a UK in decline, particularly post-Brexit. Which is fascinating because the UK was on a decline before it entered into the European community. Now, having left in 2016 since the referendum, has seen that further decline. So this argument of a broad shoulders of the United Kingdom, the UK being an economy you can rely on, I think that's been shattered to pieces. What we haven't done enough of, done it to a certain extent in terms of the economy paper, what we have to do is have a much more powerful message of how an independent Scotland can use those levers. And we talk about levers, but people want to know, well, what does it actually mean and how do you use them in an independent Scotland to grow wealth, to create jobs, to make sure that you unleash in its entirety the potential of this country and for it to be competitive. And I often say to folk, you look at European countries of our size across Europe, compared to the UK, and they have higher productivity, they have more wealth, they have fewer people in poverty. Why on earth not Scotland?
They're also 100% committed to capitalism and economic growth. I mean, if you go to leaders in Scandinavia,
I'm not a communist. It's
no, I know. Okay, so that's fine. But if
news for you, an exclusive.
There's your headline.
But if
economic growth, I spoke about it in my very first speech in Parliament. I've
The
got
hacks
it
are
in our
actually writing that
policy,
down, mate. I think
policy prospectus. So
Yeah.
there's no question about believing in economic growth for a purpose, and I believe that purpose is, of course, to create wealth. It's to generate jobs. It's to expand the tax base, but to do that for a purpose that you can reinvest into our public services, whether that's targeted towards those who need it the most, whether it's through universal benefits that are rights that people, I think, should absolutely have, or it's to as I say, tackle anti-poverty, tackle poverty, and to invest in anti-poverty measures. It is there for a purpose, but I'm not arguing with you about economic growth, and I'm not sure why people think it's such a big surprise that the SNP believes in economic growth.
So I think there's two reasons why I think they think it's a surprise. One, the Green Party, right, and that there is palpable worry about that in the business community. And two, some of the policies have not lent themselves towards a belief in economic growth. Tax increases. We'll maybe talk about rent freezes because it's a particular issue, which is causing on-the-ground concern. So I don't think the policy platform has helped with the perception that you are a government that does believe in economic growth.
I mean, 100,000 properties freed from rates because of the Scottish small business bonus scheme that we've introduced, still benefiting from that. There's a number of policies I could point to that literally stop businesses from going under. And maybe there's a job for us to do in the Scottish Government, having been in position and in power for 16 years, to actually remind people of what we've done, but also, it's your challenge to me at the beginning of this podcast. What's the vision going to be in programme for government? Certainly, that's why for me in the first few months, getting the new deal for business over the line was so important. In a matter of weeks, literally resetting that relationship with business.
We're talking about independence. Let's get a question from Nairn Clark, who I hope is here somewhere. Nairn's down here. Nairn's compliment, by the way. I don't like reading these out. I just feel I should. That Calum guy sure does a stellar job of hosting and moderating.
Oh, come on.
Thanks, Nairn.
he doesn't actually do anything.
I do read the emails. I check the inbox, and Nairn knows that, and he's
Who
gamed the
show do you
system.
think this is exactly?
He's gamed the system. Nairn, thanks for submitting a question. Thanks for being here. Your question is about independence and the strategy.
I might need your help with it. I deleted it off my phone by mistake.
Careless. Careless. Well, Nairn, nice to meet you. You can have a seat again.
Thank you.
Nairn's email. Hi, Humza. First name terms. Hope you're okay with that. My question is, what happens if your plan regarding independence fails? The SNP are not successful in the general election next year, as the party do not win a majority of votes or seats or whatever your criteria happens to be. Where would that leave the independence movement, and how do you reconcile your position as party leader and First Minister with that result, having put a vote on Scottish independence to the people and lost?
So first of all, I don't like to hypothecate on loss. I think it ends up becoming a self-fulfilling prophecy, and that's why we are absolutely confident of winning the election and the general election, whenever it may be.
Which, to be clear, means winning the most Scottish seats at Westminster.
Yeah, exactly, winning
Fine.
most Scottish seats. So I'm confident in that position, and as I say, there's a heck of a lot of complacency from Labour on that, and we're not going to show an iota of that complacency at all. We're going to work as hard as we possibly can. There's no getting away from the fact that there is just no shortcut if the UK government continues to deny us the referendum. And kind of Andy's point a moment ago, when he was talking about, you know, you're 10 points away from winning it. I don't think winning it actually is the most difficult part. Getting a referendum is the most difficult part. I think actually once we have it, we have the arguments absolutely to win it. I only see it going in one direction in terms of that referendum. Now, what we have to do, if the UK government, red or blue, whoever's in number 10, if they continue to deny and deny and deny, the only way we're going to be able to break that logjam is through the power of the people. There's no other way. There's no magic shortcut. There's nothing that you can suddenly do. There's no regulation or law that we can pass that suddenly changes things overnight. It's going to have to be through the power of the people. And that's where actually the argument is right from Andy, from others, that we have to shift the dial considerably. We can't be at kind of anywhere between 45 and 52% or 53%. We're going to have to shift the dial considerably in order for people power to say we are not going to accept a continued denial from Westminster. That's the only way to do it.
But you have to do that before the next general election, according to your strategy.
What I'm saying is the general election is an opportunity to demonstrate that people power. Now, the UK government, of course, they will continue and try to continue to deny, but they can only do that for so long. They can only deny me for so long. They can't deny the people of Scotland. I don't think they can deny the people of Scotland if there is that people power right behind the movement. But the most difficult message I have to deliver the party and had to deliver during our convention is just being really open and honest that if the UK government continues to deny a referendum, there is not a shortcut there. We're going to have to use every single opportunity to put this question to the people of Scotland to demonstrate the level of support we have.
I was going to try and get in, but Geoff's going to kill me.
No chance.
He's got his eyes on the prize.
Talk me through this. I know you were given a terrible hand by your successor, and I have huge respect, as you know. Predecessor. We're not into successors yet.
Yeah, I hope not.
Careless.
Good, well picked up. Your predecessor, and I have great respect for your predecessor, but that strategy, to my opinion, put you in all sorts of difficulty. How does this work in practice? We've got a battle between who's going to be the future UK Prime Minister, Keir Starmer, Rishi Sunak, Labour or Tory. Are we going to be the SNP going into that election saying, and here's our policy on lender of last resort. Here's how we're going to take forward a Scottish currency. Here's how we're going to afford people's pensions, because we have, by definition, made that our pitch to the people. Because if we're asking for a mandate for independence, you have to therefore fight on independence.
I'll tell you what the pitch is with independence. It's actually pretty simple. It's the number one issue that comes up every time I knock a door, whether it's in the northeast, whether it's in Glasgow, whether it's in Rutherglen and Hamilton, whether it's where I'm going to be in the next couple of days in the south of Scotland. I can tell you the number one issue that keeps coming up and will keep coming up is the cost of living crisis. So I can say to somebody clearly in the doorstep and say, look, your alternative is not a Westminster that's red, where the Labour Party and Sir Keir Starmer wants to keep those measures of austerity, that are keeping you in poverty, that are increasing your bills, that, you know, not scrapping the two-child limit, not scrapping the bedroom tax, not scrapping the rape clause, is aligning himself and will continue, I suspect, my prediction is he'll continue to align himself more and more with Conservative policies. Your real alternative is actually voting for independence, taking the decisions into your own hands. That's the message that I'll take to every single doorstep. And if we win the election on that unequivocal, on page 1, line 1 of the manifesto, that a vote for the SNP is a vote for independence, then of course, if the people send that message loudly and clearly, that gives us, I believe, a mandate to negotiate how we put that into democratic effect. And there's not a shortcut, Geoff. If there was a shortcut,
I know there's
then people would have figured it out, I'm afraid, long time ago.
I've said on the podcast previously, I wouldn't even fight it at the 2024 election. I put it to the 2026 election to touch, and this one's standing up for Scotland, but that's just me. Here we are. Now, but you've said this, though, and I really want to tease this out, because you and I have been around enough election campaigns to know that you're going to be on a TV debate Bernard Ponsonby at STV. Glenn Campbell, we wish him all the best for BBC. They're going to be fighting about cost of living crisis. And then Glenn Campbell could legitimately turn around to you and say, and what currency are they going to be paying that in?
And we will say what we've said on the currency already, that we will keep the Scottish.
Do you
we will
think that's
keep
going
the
to
pound.
appeal to a voter in
What
this
will-
context?
What will appeal to the voter?
Does it
in the-
appeal?
what-
There's 100 people in this room. Does it appeal to you by way of applause? Is that appealing?
Well, what I think will appeal
There's
to people.
silence, First Minister.
Yeah, well, look, what will appeal to people? Look, I will try to persuade as many people in this audience, but I will take it to every doorstep in the country. What will appeal to people is that you can either have, conservative or conservative-like policies. That is the choice that is in front of you if you choose to vote either Conservative or for Labour. Or you can have an alternative, a real alternative, a bold, a radical alternative, which is taking decisions for yourself. And that is the alternative that we will present.
So
There's also no getting away from the fact that general elections are, for the SNP, they can be quite tough. There's a recent phenomenon post-2014 where we have had the numbers that we have had. We traditionally, particularly in so-called change elections where change is perceived, they are difficult elections for us. So there's no getting away from the fact that 2024 will be a difficult general election for us. But I'm up for the fight.
Do you think you'll lose any seats?
Again, I'm not going to get into a numbers
Oh,
game.
go on.
No, I don't hypothecate
Any? I don't want a
losing.
number. I don't want a number. Do you think you'll lose any?
I don't go into the election thinking that we're going to lose seats. I go into elections looking to win seats.
Yeah, but see that. But your question is the key here, right? Well, first of all, I'm unconvinced about the Red Tories strategy. If you look at polling on the issues you've mentioned, for example, the two-child cap and the bedroom tax, polling supports them. I think the reason they're controversial is because they're Tory policies, not because of the policies themselves. If it had been Labour policies all along, we would hardly talk about those policies, I don't think. So I'm not convinced that it might cut through in the bubble, totally unconvinced it cuts through outside the bubble. But I think actually it's all moot, right? Because I would say the biggest issue that you have at elections is the high watermark. I mean, there have been two remarkable elections in both parliaments in the last elections. You're sitting on 48 seats at Westminster, 64 seats at Holyrood, both on about 45%. And it is, I'll answer your question, yes, you're going to lose seats. And it won't be your fault, it's just the trend. And you're going to lose seats. And I think that is what's going to make the message of winning the election as a mandate. My analysis would be that message is effectively impossible, because if you don't retain the number of seats you've got, I don't think it will fly. And I think that's just, you'd have to go up another 6, 7, 8% in the next year to have a chance of retaining your 48 seats.
So there's also the point that a number of polls have shown that although the SNP support has dipped, support for independence is still pretty rock solid. I mean, it fluctuates between sometimes above 50, sometimes below 50, but it's relatively rock solid. So for putting independence front and centre of our campaign, actually for independent supporters, it could be the thing that attracts them back.
A lot of those
to
independence
the
voters,
SNP.
they've shifted to the Labour Party, which you say is not cutting through because of their support for Tory policies. They are now polling for Labour.
And for some, the attraction of voting for Labour in a general election, because people will perceive that as the best way to get rid of the Conservatives, which, again, I don't have any truck with. Because I think, if you looked at other election results where Labour have won, actually it wouldn't have made a difference which way Scotland voted, even if we've all voted for the same political party. My message to the voters is, look, the Labour Party are moving and will continue to move further and further towards the Conservatives. Let's make sure that Scotland's voice is not ignored. Even if you don't agree with everything the SNP does, the one thing you can't disagree with often, not many people will disagree with, is that we stand up for Scotland. We will bang the drum for Scotland.
That is such a tough message, though, Humza, because
it's a tough message.
If you're an ordinary person out there,
if this was an easy job, then
No, I know,
of course many people, I'm sure, would be lining up to take it. But
if you're
it's
sitting
not,
in a
it's
seat
tough
where
job.
Labour have got a chance of winning, it's really, really hard to say to that voter, actually, don't vote Labour to get rid of the Tories, when the entirety of the election campaign is framed around Starmer versus Sunak. It's a really hard message for you to have to give, to say, actually, I know it looks like if you elect a Labour MP, that'll help Keir Starmer. Actually, vote for us and we'll get rid of the Tories.
No, look, instead of, if you want to get rid of Conservative policies, don't vote for a Labour MP that supports them. Instead, actually make sure Scotland's voice is heard by voting for an SNP MP who will challenge those Conservative policies, who will challenge the two-child cap or the bedroom tax or the rape clause. And actually, is a party, the SNP, a party that is unapologetically pro-European as opposed to pro-Brexit Labour Party. And I disagree with your point about cut-through. I was in Rutherglen and Hamilton West. This was not just a few days ago, or about a week ago actually, and popped into a computer shop. Guy refurbishes laptops. Been there for 20 odd years, and he was repeating verbatim what was on our leaflet. I don't think he'd even seen our leaflet actually, but must have got it through the door. He was sitting there talking about the fact that Keir Starmer to him just sounds like a Conservative, and he doesn't trust him, and he's sceptical about him. And he's a typical Rutherglen and Hamilton West voter. He votes sometimes SNP, sometimes Labour, sometimes SNP, sometimes Labour, and that seat changes hands. So I'm not nearly as despondent. I agree with you. The message is going to be tough to try to convince voters, particularly because of the challenges we're facing, and I suspect there's still some challenges to come. But look, I'm going to give it absolutely my best shot and make sure that we give people a true alternative to vote for whenever that general election is.
Just moving on slightly on the independence argument. Our former mutual boss, not Nicola Sturgeon, Alex Salmond. I'm going to preface this question by saying that I've said publicly, and I've said to him directly, I've never really been a fan of the Alapa project. I said it to him before he did it, and I said it to him after. But nonetheless, he has done that. Nonetheless, he has a platform, and nonetheless, he has a fairly reasonable following. Now, you said in the election campaign, the leadership election campaign, that you wanted to unify the independence movement. Does that extend to an overture to Alex Salmond? Has he made an overture to you? Have you made one to him?
So, I will answer that question. Before I do, I find it difficult to understand somebody who says they really want to unify the independence movement and wants to stand, I think, on a Scotland United ticket in terms of the next general election, or even in Rutherglen and Hamilton West, and then calls the leader of the second largest pro-independence party a total idiot. I don't think...
You mean the Greens and Patrick Harvey?
The second largest political party, pro-independence party, the Greens, yeah, and that's what Alex Salmond said.
Patrick Harvey.
Yeah, Patrick Harvey.
Yeah.
He insulted Patrick Harvey in those exact terms. And to me, that doesn't scream of unity or wanting to try to unite the independence movement. And I've said this before publicly, and I'll say it to Alex, and I've only met him very briefly at the Winnie Ewing's memorial service, and we had a discussion and a bit of a chat, and spoke to Moira, who was there as well, because we do go back a long, long way.
Moira's his wife.
His wife,
yeah.
Moira as well, who was there. But what I would say to Alex is, if you're really serious about wanting the independence movement to come together, why is 90% of your political party's ammunition fired towards the SNP? That to me doesn't make any sense. So, look, I've got some issues with Alex's past behaviours, and even, as I say, currently how he's aiming his ammunition towards the SNP. But there's not been, as far as I know, an overture from him to meet. And to me, the party, although you say it's got a following, what most polls put it at 1%, maybe 2%.
So what, should he go away or should he rejoin
But he has
the
a
SNP?
platform, is my point. I mean, he's still out
He's
there.
got a platform.
So
Much to my disappointment, I've told him to shut up.
It's not
And
to
we,
me.
I mean, we-
He didn't listen.
No,
Never
it's not-
does.
it's
You said
not-
that on the
it's not-
podcast.
It's not really to me to dictate what Alex Salmond should do.
No, sure,
it would
but
be
you're
a lot more
you're saying
helpful.
that he's fragmenting the movement by throwing grenades at you guys and the SNP and indeed the Greens by extension. So then I'm confused about what you mean by fragmenting the movement if you don't mean he should work with you as part of the SNP.
I'm happy for him to have his own party and
Right.
have his pet project. I'm not sure that the way you get independence is by firing all your ammunition towards the biggest independence vehicle in the country. And I think what's a shame in all of this is people in my position, and I'm not expecting small violins to come out here, but being First Minister, the only people that really understand the job, I think, are those that have been in the job. And look, I've reached out before to people like Jack McConnell on issues around
Been on the
Malawi.
podcast?
Reached out to Henry McLeish on
Will be on
issues
the
around prison reform. I remember reaching out to, he was the Deputy First Minister, maybe First Minister for a period, wasn't he? Jim Wallace, I think Lord Wallace, for a brief period, I think.
In the way that Harry Harman
Standing
Prime
orders,
Minister,
he's right, you're right.
He was right, standing orders. So, reached out
yeah.
to Jim Wallace, and I'll speak to Nicola and so on. It would be. I think it's a shame that we
You've not spoken to
don't.
her yet.
No, I have.
Oh, you have. Sorry.
I'm saying
So
it would
you
be a
said you would
shame.
Speak to her.
No, I have spoken
Sorry,
to
I
her.
understand.
It'd be a shame, that Alex could could have been that kind of elder statesman and given advice and wise counsel, and it just doesn't seem like he's in
When
that space
Jack
at
was
all.
on the podcast, he suggested when Jack Macdonald was on the podcast, he suggested a former First Minister's WhatsApp group. Does that mean you're up for it?
I'm not a former First Minister, I'm a First Minister. Intending to remain so. So thank you. I'll be out of that WhatsApp group.
I think you should start a WhatsApp group with that fire. That'd be great. That's what we want to hear. Do you know, I'm bragging there about who we've had on the podcast, and we genuinely are very grateful for you and for everybody that's been on taking part. Two other people that have been on the podcast are Fergus Ewing and Kate Forbes. Both
big supporters of me.
Both of whom I would just want to draw on. That's interesting you say that, because I'm not sure Kate Forbes has ever been that critical of you.
No, I was more meaning Fergus Ewing, I think. He's been, look, I think Fergus and Kate, sorry, I'll let you get to your question.
No, that's fine.
But Fergus and Kate, I think for Fergus in particular, again, I say this genuinely with a measure of sadness, that somebody coming into my position, I've known Fergus for many years, I've been in the SNP for almost 20 years. Actually, it's those people that have experience that could be the most constructive, helpful, offer wise counsel, and do that in a way that is helpful to the party. You can see it when Fergus stands up, makes his points. He's got every right to make them, of course he does. But he makes his points, be it at First Minister's questions or during parliamentary questions. The only people applauding are the Conservative Party, and that's not going to help our party or help our movement. Kate and I, and people sometimes struggle to believe it, we get along very well. And our kids got along particularly well during the hustings, the 19 hustings, I think, that we did, and our families were dragged across to. And you're right, she's not been terribly critical. But I think for Kate, my regret really is I wish she'd come into government. And, I think she's made that decision not to come in. I think there are other ways that we could use Kate, and Andy mentioned the economy, and there's no doubt she's got skills in relation to the economy. There's definitely roles there for Kate, and I'm certain we can.
And do you think she? As soon as you won, actually, I wrote a column. I'm sure you read it. Fridays in the Herald. Humza, I know you read it every week.
Oh, Andy. Every week.
Well, I suggested that the sensible thing to do in terms of party unity and in terms of the country and the overall message would be to make Kate DFM and Economy and Finance Secretary, Deputy First Minister and Economy. Do you think she would have taken that job if you had offered her it?
So only Kate could answer that question. But for me, there was two important factors. One, you have to have your Finance Secretary absolutely 100% aligned with your vision and what you're looking to do. And Shona was that person. She's absolutely aligned with what we want
what
to
was
do
it about Kate's vision that wasn't aligned?
Again, she had some challenge. It was all played out during the election contest, but there were some differences around progressive taxation, for example. But also, I think for Kate, it is good to get experience of public service delivery roles as well as the Finance Secretary role, which is of course an important one. But ultimately, Kate had her reasons, and she has articulated those publicly of why she thought a period out of government would be best for her. But I would never close the door to Kate being back in government if she wanted to come back in, of course.
She told the podcast that when she went back to Parliament after the leadership contest, that she would extend the hand of friendship, and she said, and I'm quoting, "I'm very happy to pick up where I left it with friends and colleagues last summer. That's always going to be a two-way street, so it remains to be seen whether the hand of friendship that I offer is reciprocated." Fergus Ewing told this podcast just a couple of weeks ago that the atmosphere among SNP MSPs is toxic at Holyrood. It doesn't sound like there are many hands of friendship being extended.
So again, I just don't recognise that toxic characterisation. I go to our group regularly and speak to our group. Yes, of course, there's been challenges and difficulties, particularly during an election contest, a leadership contest. There's going to be that, but I don't recognise that toxic atmosphere. Fergus may want to ask why there may be some in the group that are frustrated at his interventions, but I think that's probably a pretty obvious question to answer. So for Kate, again, I would hope that...
Do you consider her a friend?
Yeah, I consider Kate a friend, yeah. As I say, we travelled the country for quite a number of weeks, and our families did, and you get to know people really well, and beyond the headlines, there's, Kate's a person I respect. I think she respects me. And as I say, there is always the doors open for Kate to be back in government if that's something that she wishes.
Let's do another question. This one is from Jack Allen. Where are you, Jack? You here? There's Jack there. By the way, Jack's compliment is just here. I feel I owe it to him. This is a quite nice one. If it weren't for this podcast and the football, me and my dad would have a lot less to talk about every day. So thank you.
Aww.
That's really nice, isn't it? Your podcast has provided hours of meaningful father and son bonding time, which is very lovely. Thank you, Jack, and thank you for being here. What's your question for the First Minister?
Yeah, firstly, thank you for taking the question. It's
Not
really
at all.
appreciated. Humza, listeners to the podcast, and it's a great podcast, have heard many politicians, as we just mentioned, Kate Forbes, Fergus Ewing, mentioned that the party's approach to kind of pragmatic policy making, business, and the coalition with the Greens is a point that they disagree with. I think the Scottish public and people here just want a bit of realism, a bit of pragmatism, and subject matters that impact their daily lives to be addressed properly, and also without the answer always being independence. And then, I'm a business owner. I started a business when I was at uni, and I've grown it kind of throughout my 20s. And I've heard from members of the kind of Scottish business community that you're a very kind of pragmatic, collegiate person when they meet you in private. So to me, something doesn't add up. What is it that you see in the kind of coalition with the Greens, and what is the polling, public opinion, things that you're hearing that make you honestly believe that that's going to be a successful strategy polling-wise? Because it doesn't add up to me.
Yeah, it's a good question. So there's so many...
There's a lot of nods, by the way, just for those who are listening at home. There's a lot of nods around the room right now. I don't know if you saw that.
Yeah. So, okay, there's a few facets to that question which I'll try to peel off and answer if I can. So in terms of the coalition with the Greens and what do you see... Actually, before I go to that point, the pragmatic issues, or the everyday issues that affect people. I think one of the challenges for the SNP is if you were to ask people what is it the SNP talks about, what has the SNP government, the Scottish government been focused on, a number of people would look at issues like the GRR, like trans rights, for example, Gender Recognition Reform Bill. And I'm a wholehearted supporter of it. I would vote for it again. Obviously, I've challenged the UK government Section 35 in court, and that will play out over the coming weeks. But it's clear that people think that is, and issues like identity issues and other issues are the ones that we obsess about, and that, well, do you actually care about cost of living or public services or growing the economy? So I think there's a challenge in there for us to go, yep, passionate supporters of people's rights. I say that as a minority myself and somebody who's been, attacked, discriminated, abused on a fairly regular basis because of his race. So I do think we should stand wholeheartedly, but we also have to communicate what it is we're doing for people in their everyday lives. And I think that's going to be a real challenge for us. And what I try to do in our policy prospectus, and doesn't get always cut through given everything else that's going on, really focused on what we are going to achieve between now and 2026, and a real focus on delivery. And I think that's what people want to see, is that focus on delivery. In terms of the Greens, I'll say a couple of things. First and foremost...
Somebody's knocked their glass over.
First and foremost, I would say people I do think want to see political parties working together. I think they say it to me all the time. Like, I wish political parties, because some of you have... Actually, most political parties, they'll say, we'll have some good ideas that we'll agree on. So why can't you just get together and work together? And that's what we've got with the Greens. We've got two different political parties. Yep, we've got some policies in common. We've got some policies we don't agree with, hence why they're excluded from the Butte House Agreement. And we work together. And what I think is the best interest of Scotland. There is also a pragmatic political reason as well, because that Parliament, I can tell you now, for the 12 years that I've been elected, is by far the most toxic I've ever been in. And we've all got responsibility to detoxify it as best as we possibly can. But there is no way I'm passing a budget that Douglas Ross is going to vote for, or Anna Sauer, frankly, is going to vote for. It just ain't going to happen in a month of Sundays. And having that political stability, that majority in Parliament, to not just pass your budget, but your legislative programme, for me is I've often said, is worth its weight in gold. It absolutely is.
Right. Jack, thank you for your question, first of all. There's lots to get into here. It's very topical. It's very prescient. Let's, first of all, ask you, will the Butte House Agreement still be intact come the 2026 election?
Yes.
It will?
Yes.
Fine. Good. Do you accept that the Greens exert influence on the direction of the Scottish Government?
They are part of the Scottish Government.
Yes,
so
on the SNP
they
bit
are,
of the
they are
Scottish
part
Government.
of the Scottish Government, so there's no doubt that they exert influence.
Right.
If you're part
Is it
of the
too
government,
much influence?
No, I believe that they absolutely have influence. I think they push us to go further on certain issues, which is no bad
Further
thing.
than you'd like?
No, further than perhaps we've committed to in our manifestos, perhaps further than we thought we would go to, not
That's
further
odd,
than we
isn't
would
it?
like.
If it's further than what's in your manifesto, that's
No.
jarring for voters.
No, I don't think that is, because people want to see political parties work together. We have this agreement, cooperation agreement. We were voted in as a minority government. We have to accept that, not far off a majority, but voted in as a minority government. So therefore, the message is you should cooperate with other political parties to progress your political agenda. And working with the Greens.
What 3 words would you use to describe Lorna Slater?
I'm not sure why. But I'm not sure why some in the audience, because Lorna, I'll come to the 3 words in a minute. But Lorna is somebody who faces. I mean, I've seen a lot of misogyny in that parliament. There's still a lot in there in that parliament, but somebody who works incredibly hard. So I would say she's absolutely hardworking. I would say she's diligent in terms of detail, and I would say she is incredibly compassionate in terms of her politics.
We'll give you hard working as one
One
word. I
word,
think
please
sometimes
do.
it's hyphenated, I suppose. Go on, Geoff.
I thought that, going back a few answers when you talked about the importance of the Greens, I thought your first part of your answer was excellent. People do want to see more collaboration across the parties and parties working together. But where you lost me is when you start, and I've heard this argument being articulated by a number of SNP ministers, and it bugs me something rotten. This idea that anyone out there cares about legislative processes and getting votes passed. Now, I cannot accept an argument whereby the Greens, for whatever reason, happen to be out with government and voted against your budget and essentially caused an election. The same Green Party that owe all of their recent success to the SNP's second vote and the regional vote. I cannot accept that. And I do think there is room for you to show more teeth, a little bit more robustness in the face of that, because the perception, and as we both know, perception in politics is everything. Forget the reality. Perception is they're taking you lot for a ride.
Well,
So what are you going to do to try and arrest that perception?
Let's remember, we're the ones in the Scottish Government who have, for example, changed course in relation to HPMAs, and we hear the communities who spoke vocally about that. Ultimately, again, before the UK Government took action in relation to vetoing and torpedoing the DRS, it was me when I came in who said, right, we need to listen to our business community around the readiness of that scheme, so let's delay, let's make changes, let's listen to those business concerns where they are absolutely legitimate. And for me, at this point about people not caring around electoral process, I agree with that. But they do actually care if legislation is passed because it impacts them. So they may not care about the process, I accept that. But also, I suppose, thirdly, for those that do believe in independence, like me, like you, having a pro-independence majority in Parliament, I think, is an absolute strength, not a weakness. I actually think genuinely this is more of a bubble story, I'm sorry to say. It does not get referenced to me on many doorsteps. Comes up on occasion, for sure. Comes up to some people when I was speaking to them about the A96 in the northeast. So it definitely comes up. But I have to say it is not number 1, number 2, or number 3 issue, I'm afraid, that comes up time and time and time again.
I can actually believe that last point, because I think, NHS, cost of living and things will come up earlier. But if we go back, I mean, look, the Greens won the lottery without having to buy a ticket. It's what happened in 2021. As soon as Jackie Baillie won that seat, let's be honest, if Jackie Baillie hadn't won that seat and you had 65, you wouldn't have spoken to them because you didn't need to. So this was not a decision to create a progressive alliance. It was a numbers game. Right, and that's the reason it came about.
Well, we didn't even have to speak to them because we have done minority government before. Mm-hmm. Some was
very
quite
successfully.
And there was a good chief of staff there at the time.
By working with
managed to get all our budgets passed without the Greens.
That's exactly the point I was about to make. The point actually I was about to make was exactly that if you think Douglas Ross is a McCletchie, or a Annabelle Goldie, or even a Ruth Davidson, I'm afraid he is absolutely not.
I agree with you on that.
And there is no way we would pass.
But you also at that point had
budget.
50-something seats. And here you've got 64, so you don't need a lot of bribery to get your budget passed with 64 seats, right? But anyway,
we don't do bribery.
I'll edit out bribery.
I'll keep us out of court.
We'll use a different word. Look, I think we can talk about things like HPMAs, but a lot of them have been stopped or changed when they were still theoretical. In Edinburgh in particular, in Glasgow, there is the reality of rent caps, which we know because I see it in daily life, and we have evidence now, and we hear about it, and the studies have been done that institutional investors in particular, if they've got a decision to make over whether to build a buy-to-rent block of flats in Birmingham or Edinburgh, they're going to choose Birmingham because they see this as a hostile environment and the return is not as high. And we also know, because again, in my daily life with SMEs, I speak to people who run letting agencies, for instance, where landlords have sold because they don't think it's worth having a flat anymore, where rents for a one-bedroom flat will go from $695 to $995 in between lets because they don't know when the next time they're going to put it up. The result of that policy has been a suppression of supply and therefore an increase in rents. It's not doing what it was supposed to do, but I don't think you can change it because I don't think the Greens will let you change it. And is that where we potentially get to a problem, is the policies in practice are very, in theory, they could be changed like HPMAs. In practice, how do you change them when you know they're not working?
Well, remember the rent cap is a temporary measure. And people can, of course, landlords can, of course, increase their rent 3%, 6% in certain specific circumstances as well. But the Parliament would have to vote for it to continue until March 2024 and not beyond that. So it's a temporary measure that's in place for a good reason, and was in for a good reason, particularly during COVID. And then, of course, we've had the cost of living crisis. And you talk to anybody in the city about the cost of rent, that actually people in the city in particular, not only in Edinburgh, but in particular, are really thankful for having those rent controls in place. In terms of policy, we are living through a time where, as I have said, literally, just a few weeks ago, the UN said July was the hottest month in human history. The climate emergency is not some future existential threat. It's happening right now. Whether it's heat records being broken in Europe, whether it's Maui on fire, and my hearts go out to every single family devastated by that tragedy. Being in coalition with a Green Party that puts the climate emergency, as we do, front and centre of its policy making, I think is a good thing. Absolutely, they do. You don't think the Green Party believe in tackling the climate emergency?
I think the Green Party, as Patrick Harvey said in response to Robin Harper the other day, I think the Green Party's focus has shifted from climate onto social policy.
No, the social policy is certainly an element of the policy prospectus, as it is ours as well.
But we could slip into the presumption that Green Party policy is green policy. That's not always necessarily the case. Green Party policy would stop oil and gas extraction full stop, which would prevent the profits that the renewables industry needs to press on with renewables. Now, that's not Green Party policy, but a lot of people would argue that it is green policy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and again, you're right to make the distinction between Green Party policy and green policy. My point is that at a time when the existential threat of the climate emergency has never been so real, being in a cooperation agreement with the Green Party, for me, makes sure that issue of the climate emergency, they are pushing us in the SNP. Not that I think we necessarily altogether need it, given how dramatic, particularly recent events have been, but they make sure that we are being pushed as far as we possibly can on these issues in government. That's no bad thing.
Just a quick final one, potentially, on this, actually. I'm just going to put some quotes to you. "They're killing us," one SNP MSP told the Herald on Sunday, as to the Greens' involvement in government. Joanna Cherry said she wants to see the agreement renegotiated. Fergus Ewing, "Members supported by a majority, the two candidates who would likely have scrapped the Butte House agreement. A majority of those members who voted in their first preference, 52% voted for either Ash Regan or Kate Forbes. Both expressed serious concerns about the deal. Kate Forbes says the party should check in with members about the content of the deal. Will you do that?"
We just checked in. We just had a leadership contest, and I stood
But that's the point. That's the point.
stood unequivocally. I'll come to that
Yeah.
point, because Kate didn't say we should rip up the agreement with the Greens at all. Ash took a much harder view, and that's fine, and she got, 11% of the vote. My point is that we just checked in with members on the Butte House agreement.
But there's been a material change, hasn't there?
And they backed me as the candidate who unequivocally stood in the platform to continue that cooperation agreement.
But your party's eating itself.
No, there's some people who disagree vociferously, and Fergus Ewing chiefly amongst them, in terms of our cooperation agreement with the Greens. But for me, look, parties that navel gaze continually rightly get punished. We have put this to the members. We have an agreement in place. Yes, there are review mechanisms ourselves within the Butte House Agreement. You can read it there in terms of government checking in on where we are in terms of the Butte House Agreement. But for me, it is. I know it is still a cooperation agreement that is backed by our party.
So signed, sealed, delivered till the next election, 2026. For example, no discussion on this with members at conference coming up in a few months.
Look, I don't think it will be discussed at conference. It's not for me to decide what the conference agenda is.
But you don't want to see it
That's
on
for
the agenda?
conferences. That's for conferences committee
Okay.
to decide. I've said that the conferences committee will get the full authority to look at what comes in front of conference and what doesn't. And of course, we just had an independence convention where I think 50 speakers from the SNP spoke. I wasn't there looking at the cards and deciding who spoke. We had Ash Regan speaking, for example. We had many other people speaking at that convention. And I'm not sure the Green Deal was mentioned at once. And if it was, it certainly wasn't mentioned by the majority of members by any stretch of the imagination.
Okay, very interesting. Right, we want to move it on. Let us go to our next question, which is from Philip. Where's Philip? Have you made it, Philip? Here's Philip here. We'll just get a microphone to you while I read another compliment.
Have you not had any questions from any women at all? It's all been men.
Good point.
Well, fair. I mean, have you submitted questions? What would you like to ask? Submit your question now.
It's your fault.
No, I'm saying I'm not sure what the submissions have been, but you're welcome to submit them. holyroodsources.com/ask is where to submit your questions. Philip said, simply the best analysis of Scottish politics available. Thanks very much, Philip. Thanks for being here. What's your question?
First Minister, I travelled from Inverness today, a journey I've probably made 2,000 times in my life. And for the last 5 years, I've had to pass a point in the road where I was the first on the scene of a head-on collision and someone died in my arms as I was giving them first aid. When will the promise to the Highlands to dual the A9 and the A96 be delivered?
Yeah, I'm sorry you had to go through that. So I can't pluck you a date. I can't tell you a date when the A9 dualling will be complete, or the A96. I will say more about the A9, particularly in the programme for government. I hope to say more about the A9 in particular. And that commitment to dual the A9 and A96 continues to be our party policy. And particularly on the A9, there's just no argument about the fact that that commitment is cast iron. On A96, Inverston Nairn, including the Nairn bypass, again, there's no disagreement or argument about that. For the other sections, yeah, we are looking at climate compatibility because it is important, given the fact that we're going to have to take some really difficult decisions right across every single portfolio, not just transport, but we look about heating buildings, agriculture, and so many others if it comes to meeting our really ambitious and world-leading climate change targets. But I can give you an absolute promise, and don't take my word for it. I mean, judge us by our deeds for sure when it comes to dualling of the A9. That is going to be a significant priority for us and for me and the administration that I lead, as well as making progress on the A96. So without giving an exclusive to these guys, just watch this space in a couple of weeks' time. I hope to be able to say more.
We're very grateful for your time, by the way. We don't have ages left, so if you've got questions, now's the time. Let's go to a question from Jill next, who says, Jill, are you here? This is on skills gaps, on further education. I think Jill's over at the back, over that way. Love the podcast. Listen every week, says Jill. The analysis insightful from Geoff and Andy. That's nice. That's a compliment for you both, then. Particularly enjoyed the recent analysis on SQA results. Looking forward to an episode focused on education in future, which we absolutely will do. Hello, Jill. What's your question?
Hi, Calum. Thanks very much. I've worked in further education and higher education for the last 20 years in Scotland. And I think there's growing concern around what's evidently a skills gap, which has emerged and continues to grow. So just, Humza, very interested to hear how you plan to address the consistent underfunding that I believe there has been in further education moving forward.
So first and foremost, funding education is, of course, going to be a significant priority for us. And again, that will be demonstrated through the budget. And that's why I talk about progressive taxation for me. And again, we'll give more detail of that in the months to come when we finalise, of course, our budget, because we are living in the most difficult times in terms of the pressure on the public finances. I can't get away from it. And there are a whole host of commitments. You've just heard a moment ago, for example, on our capital budget, a commitment in relation to A9, A96. And of course, on our resource budget, a whole host of commitments. So we've got to find ways of course, increasing the tax base where we can, but in ensuring that we have more revenue to spend on further and higher education. I suppose the point I wanted to make is, for me, focusing on the poverty-related attainment gap is, of course, important, and people will rightly judge the government on the progress we make on that, but also making sure that we have excellence in education. And you'll have heard Jenny Gilruth, former teacher, of course, now Cabinet Secretary for Education, talk relentlessly about that, and she will continue to do that. We cannot be complacent, and we will never be complacent about our education system. We talk about it being world-class, and we have an excellent example of world-class university, of course, in this city. But even when it comes to our school education, I don't want us at all to demonstrate an iota of complacency. Excellence in education is why I decided that we made the decision pretty early on to rejoin some international league tables, to have that comparison in relation to how we match up with other countries in the world. So you'll, as well as hearing us talk about reducing the poverty-related attainment gap, narrowing that poverty-related attainment gap, substantially reducing it, what more can we do to ensure that we have excellence in education, I think, is going to be the key challenge.
Just very quickly, I mean, I think it's a really important point about colleges, actually. Sandy Begbie from SFE is in the room, who's also chair of the Developing Young Workforce, and wrote a very important thing about No Wrong Path. And, you know, I think in this country we treat the college sector with a kind of nod of the head, as if it's a place to go when you can't quite work out what to do with yourself because you didn't get into university. It's not that. It shouldn't be that. It's as important as the university sector. And I think, you know, that's something that needs a lot of thought. As you know, I could fill a podcast, Calum, with education. I'm not going to, with my experience of 4 kids in state school. But, you know, fundamentally, I want to say well done for rejoining Tim's and Pearls. It's a critically important step for Scottish education. The only one we're in now is PISA, as you know,
these are the
which has us,
these are the
international comparisons. We pull out of them. We're still in PISA, which has us outside the top 30. So we shouldn't be saying we're excellent at education because the data tells us different. But I think first we need to know how we're doing before we can then decide what to do about it. So I think it's only fair to say a big thumbs up for rejoining the schemes, because I think, you know, we need to understand where we actually are before we can decide what needs to be done about it.
We've covered so much ground, and we are very, very grateful. We're nearly there, I promise. I was just going to ask a quick one on energy, because that's always an important topic in our podcast. I think it's important that we ask you about...
Geoff has never mentioned it in the podcast. Has he ever spoken about energy?
Honestly.
I've mentioned it a couple of times in passing. No, I'm not going to bore everyone, because I think people know my views.
I think you are.
But I was on the... Sorry, is that in the... Yeah, sorry. I was on the train on the way down. I was accosted by this man, Paul, the handsome man here.
Hi, Paul. Thanks for being here.
A long-term SNP supporter, might be in the balance just now, and his words were pretty profound. He said, "The problem for me is the SNP's presumption against oil and gas exploration feels like a presumption against my career, my livelihood, and my ability to put food on my family's table. Are the SNP going to address that in their upcoming policy interventions?"
So we will address it, and I've said really clearly to people that when it comes to decisions about future oil and gas licences, I think it's right that we start from a position of saying, look, we need to be convinced about why they should go ahead, because we are facing a climate emergency. It's not just the carbon footprint of actually extracting that oil and gas, but then what happens in relation to its usage. So I think we're right to question that and start from that position. But there's 3 things I think that need to be factored in. One is our climate obligations. You know, we need to try to keep 1.5 degrees alive. If we don't keep that alive, then the planet is literally facing an existential threat. But secondly, it has to be workers. I mean, we should never be forgiven if we do to the northeast what Thatcher did to mining and steel communities right across the country. We should never be forgiven if that's what we do. We're not going to do that. So trying to accelerate that just transition, hence why one of my first announcements as First Minister was an additional 25 million towards that just transition, is really important. And then energy security, I think, is hugely important, not just domestically, but internationally too. When I was in Europe recently in Brussels, the #1 issue they wanted to talk to me about continually was how Scotland can help to provide a solution to the energy challenge they're facing. They're desperately keen, Europe, of course, to get off foreign imports of gas, Russian gas in particular, and Scotland has the ability to play a massive role, I think, in that. So workers absolutely are going to be at the heart of that, but I don't think it's wrong to start from a position of saying, actually, look, we need convincing. And certainly I don't support Rishi Sunak coming up and saying 100 new licences should be granted.
One follow-up, if I may, and this is not more of an observation and maybe a little bit of advice. Who knows, Humza? Yeah, you might, but it strikes me that you mentioned other countries every country's facing an energy security challenge. We're actually in quite a unique position in Scotland, as we have the critical mass of skills and experience owing to oil and gas that can really make a significant inroad to this, actually put us at a competitive advantage. And I'm talking about particularly offshore wind, floating offshore wind, which I think we both know has got huge potential for us. But the problem is, right now, and we're seeing it with some announcements coming out just now, is that there's going to be delays to a lot of this offshore wind, even the ScotWind, fantastic announcement, incidentally, from the Scottish Government. And we're not going to have them available at scale. You cannot ask companies to suddenly say, look, it's coming. Honestly, guys, hold on all your workforce. There's projects coming. You'll be all right. You'll be all right. Just foist out a little bit more cash and you'll be okay. That's not how a supply chain works. It's not how an economic growth strategy works. No. So it's really important, I think, that that's acknowledged in whatever you say about oil and gas, because if we want to accelerate to net zero and actually be more carbon friendly, lower our emissions and do it at pace, you actually need to do it with the critical mass that's been brought up in oil and gas. One final question, I know we've got to go, it's a more observation. We're in the city of Edinburgh. Financial services, world-class financial services, asset management, particularly. We've got a world-class energy sector. You combine the two, not only can you get to net zero with the high-value manufacturing, you can finance it as well. Now that says to me there's an economic strategy for growth in Scotland that should really be looked at by the Scottish Government.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's why I'm going to see Phoenix, I think, in just a couple of weeks. You know, I'm going to speak to Phoenix about that's one of the issues we'll be talking about. I know we're pressed for time.
I just want to get you home for your tea. I mean, we can stay all night if you want to.
I mean, this takes us right back to the start, though, actually, about you being able to stamp a vision on this, because we often talk about sides in that debate. You know, you're on the side of hydrocarbons or you're on the side of renewables. The reality of that debate is that without the profits of renewables, the current profits of renewables...
oil and gas.
Current profits of hydrocarbons, of oil and gas, Andy. There is no future renewables industry. And actually, being able to... And if you articulated that very strongly and very clearly, a lot of people would come with you on that, because it's very understandable and it's also true. And I think that's the sort of thing that could really... be the Humza vision, which we haven't heard before.
Yeah, I don't know how many times you're going to try Yousafism, Humzaism, but it's not working.
I did change it.
But I take your point. I think there is definitely got to be a discussion about transition and the pace of that transition. Right? And I want to accelerate that transition and that pace. So I hear what you and Geoff have to say. The slight counter to that, and some of my concern comes in is, look, oil and gas is lucrative, far more lucrative in terms of a commodity. You can just see that from the prices in relation to renewables as things stand. And therefore, if there's a decision for a supply chain worker to either, or supply chain company to go to oil and gas or to go to renewables, many of them, not all of them, many of them will go to oil and gas. And so my concern, you can come in a second, don't worry. My concern is that if we don't shift that balance, then we end up that supply chain being completely focused on oil and gas, where we need to make pace with infrastructure and renewables.
Very, very quickly, and you said this to me the other day, and I thought about it, and I thought, but there's your jobs boom. Mm-hmm. You know, if you think about it, with the profits of oil and gas, but I think we're thinking this is binary things. I think Andy's touched on it there. You know, everyone thinks about big oil, Shell, Equinor, BP, Total. But it's the supply chains that support them that are so critical. Mm-hmm. They're the ones that are so critical. So they can have the best of both worlds. Come up here and get the benefit.
Not when they have a workforce shortage, the size and scale. Now, if I had immigration powers, we could absolutely incentivise them.
So right now we have a problem with a working age population. We can't attract people to our country. I tell you what would attract them. High value jobs in an energy sector, underpinned by oil and gas profits as you transition to renewables. That's my point about a growth strategy. And I think that's how you've got to attempt. Sorry, that's not fair. Okay,
no,
I'm going to shut up.
I don't necessarily disagree.
This is like literally what we do when we're chatting.
My question is, what would you be doing if you were Chief of Staff right now and we needed to get the First Minister off the stage and out the door?
I'm going to reveal something, and I know we're live, and I know I did my Sean Connery story earlier on. There was an instance. I'm looking over here, guys. This is not for the journalists. This is more for fun, and I did actually. It was a very awkward moment. I won't go into detail because we are live, but I did actually knock a fire alarm once at an event.
Did you?
And I will not tell you where it was.
Okay.
Well, I think you can get fined for that, can't you? Retrospectively.
No. Sorry. Somebody I knew
admission.
close
Right,
to me
okay,
knocked
yeah.
a fire alarm.
Just thought I'd let you
Just to
correct the record
clarify.
there. It's the edit. That's for the edit suite.
At the next live event, Geoff will tell that full story before we start recording, and that'll be specifically for anyone who's with us. First Minister Humza Yousaf, thank you very much. Thank you for being here. The First Minister.
Thank you.
Thank you also to the Scotch Whisky Association's Made to Be Measured campaign, who are sponsoring this podcast, as you know, and to them, and indeed to Diageo for hosting us in the magnificent Johnny Walker on Princes Street in Edinburgh. Thank you to our producers, Angus Mitchell and Ollie Lewis. Thank you to our technical production team, led by Scott Davidson. Thank you to Geoff Aberdein and to Andy Maciver. And most importantly, thank you for coming. This is unbelievably 6 months since Nicola Sturgeon announced she was going to resign. 10 days later, we launched this podcast, and here we are filling a room, and we are so, so grateful for you being here, for you listening and subscribing and showing up. So thank you very much, and we will speak to you next week. Thank you.